The penthouse gleamed under the Manhattan sunrise, its glass walls reflecting a city that never slept. Inside, the air was thick with tension, not the usual hum of wealth and power. Marcus Caldwell, tech billionaire, stood frozen by the floor-to-ceiling windows, his coffee cup trembling in his hand. Below him, New York buzzed, oblivious to the scene unfolding in his pristine living room. His maid, Amara Jones, a black woman whose quiet strength had always grounded this sterile space, stood clutching her cheek, eyes wide with shock. A red mark bloomed across her dark skin, stark against the morning light. Standing over her was Victoria Langley, Marcus's fiancée, her manicured hand still raised, her face twisted in a sneer. "You don't belong here," Victoria spat, her voice venomous. "Know your place." Marcus's heart thudded. He'd seen deals collapse, empires crumble, but nothing like this. Amara, who'd worked for him for 5 years, who'd raised 2 kids on her own while keeping his home immaculate, didn't flinch. Her eyes, though, burned with a quiet fury that made Marcus's stomach churn. He'd always prided himself on fairness, on being the good billionaire. But now, in his own home, he was witnessing something raw, ugly, and undeniable. Victoria's slap wasn't just an act of violence, it was a declaration of a world Marcus had ignored for too long. The room felt like it was closing in. Amara's gaze flicked to Marcus, not pleading, but searching, as if daring him to act. Victoria, oblivious to his presence, stepped closer to Amara. "You think you're special because he keeps you around. You're nothing." Each word was a blade, cutting deeper into the silence. Marcus's mind raced. He'd built a fortune on quick decisions, but this moment paralyzed him. He'd known Victoria's sharp tongue, her elitism, but this was something else. Something he couldn't unsee. Outside, the city roared on, but inside, time stopped. Marcus's phone buzzed on the counter, probably another board meeting or stock update, but it felt a world away. He stepped forward, his polished shoes clicking on the marble floor, breaking the spell. "Victoria," he said, his voice low, trembling with something he couldn't name. She spun around, her expression shifting from rage to surprise, then to a practiced charm. "Marcus, darling, you don't understand." She was disrespectful. Stop." His voice was steel now, cutting through her excuses. Amara stood tall, her hand still on her cheek, her eyes locked on his. The weight of her gaze was unbearable, a mirror reflecting his privilege, his silence, his complicity. He'd spent years building algorithms to predict human behavior, but nothing had prepared him for this. The slap was more than an act, it was a crack in the facade of his perfect life, exposing the rot beneath. He glanced at the coffee table, where a small wooden tray held Amara's cleaning supplies. A cloth lay folded neatly, and on it, someone had scrawled a note in bold yellow marker, edged in black, "Hate divides us all." The words hit him like a punch. Had Amara written it? Or was it Victoria's cruel taunt? Either way, it was a truth he couldn't ignore. The tension in the room was a living thing, coiling tighter, ready to snap. Marcus's mind flashed to his childhood in rural Ohio, where he'd seen prejudice in quieter forms, whispers, sidelong glances, the way his black classmates were always last picked for teams. He'd told himself he'd risen above it, that his success meant he'd escaped those small-town biases. But here, in his own home, the truth was undeniable. Victoria's actions weren't just personal, they were part of a larger, uglier system. And he'd let it fester under his roof. "Get out," he said to Victoria, his voice barely above a whisper but heavy with finality. Her eyes widened, her charm crumbling. "Marcus, you can't mean that. She's just..." I said get out. His tone left no room for argument. Victoria's face flushed, but she grabbed her purse and stormed toward the elevator, her heels clicking like gunfire. The door slid shut, and the room fell silent, save for the faint hum of the city below. Marcus turned to Amara, who hadn't moved, her hand now at her side, her expression unreadable. I'm sorry, he said, the words feeling inadequate, like trying to patch a sinking ship with tape. Amara's lips pressed into a thin line, and she nodded once, sharp and deliberate. I don't need your sorry, Mr. Caldwell, she said, her voice steady but laced with pain. I need you to see. Her words hit harder than the slap. See what? The injustice in his home. The privilege he'd wielded without question. Or something bigger. Something he'd spent his life avoiding. He didn't know how to answer, but he knew this moment would change everything. Amara picked up her cleaning cloth, the one with the bold yellow words, and walked toward the kitchen, her steps measured, her dignity intact. Marcus stood alone, the weight of his wealth and power suddenly feeling like a burden he didn't know how to carry. Amara moved through the kitchen with the same quiet precision she always had, but Marcus could feel the shift in the air. The penthouse, once a symbol of his success, now felt like a stage where truths were being laid bare. He followed her, unsure of what to say, but driven by a need to bridge the chasm that had opened between them. Amara, he started, his voice softer now. I didn't know she was capable of that. It was a weak excuse, and he knew at the moment the words left his mouth. Amara paused, her hands gripping a sponge, her back to him. You didn't know? She repeated, her tone flat but heavy with meaning. That's the problem, Mr. Caldwell. You don't know what it's like to live in my skin. Her words stung, not because they were harsh, but because they were true. Marcus had built his empire on data, on understanding patterns, but he'd never truly understood the weight of Amara's reality. He thought of the times he'd seen her smile at his guests, pour their wine, clean their messes, all while they barely acknowledged her existence. He'd told himself it was just her job, that she was well paid, that he treated her with respect. But respect, he realized now, wasn't enough when the world outside his penthouse didn't extend her the same. I want to make this right, he said, stepping closer. Amara turned, her eyes searching his face, not with anger, but with a weary skepticism. Make it right, she asked. How? You can't undo what's done. And it's not just about today. She set the sponge down, her movements deliberate. It's about every day. Every time I walk into a room and feel eyes judging me before I even speak. Every time I'm reminded I'm less because of who I am. Marcus felt a knot tighten in his chest. He wanted to argue, to say he wasn't like that. But her words echoed Victoria's cruelty. The same cruelty he'd ignored in boardrooms, in social circles, in his own life. He thought of the charity galas he attended, where he'd donate millions to causes he barely understood, all while people like Amara lived in a world that judged them at every turn. I see you, Amara, he said finally, his voice breaking. I'm starting to see. She didn't respond, just picked up her cleaning supplies and moved to the next room. Marcus followed, his mind racing. He thought of his company, Caldwell Tech, a titan in AI and data analytics. He'd built tools that shaped how people saw the world, but he'd never questioned how those tools might reinforce the biases he was only now confronting. He pulled out his phone and texted his assistant, canceling his meetings for the day. He needed time to think, to act, to do something that wasn't just a hollow gesture. By noon, the story had leaked. Marcus didn't know how maybe a staff member overheard. Maybe Victoria had vented to her socialite friends, but his phone was buzzing with notifications. News outlets were already spinning the incident. Billionaire's fiancé slaps Maid in racist outburst. The headlines were brutal, and Marcus's PR team was in a frenzy, demanding a statement. He ignored them, his focus on Amara, who was now dusting the bookshelves. Her movements mechanical, her face a mask of resolve. "Amara," he said, his voice urgent now. "This is going to get bigger." The press theory already talking. She paused, her hand hovering over a leather-bound book. "Let them talk," she said quietly. "They always do. But what are you going to do about it?" Her question hung in the air, a challenge he couldn't ignore. He didn't have an answer yet, but he knew silence wasn't an option anymore. Marcus spent the afternoon in his study, staring at the city below, grappling with what doing something meant. He thought of his platform, his influence, the millions who followed his every move. He'd always used his voice to sell products, to shape markets. But now he saw an opportunity, a responsibility to say something real. He opened his laptop and began drafting a statement, not for the press, but for himself, a way to process the guilt and anger swirling inside him. He wrote about Amara, about her dignity, about the slap that wasn't just a moment, but a symptom of a deeper sickness. He didn't know if he'd share it, but the act of writing felt like a step toward something honest. By evening, the story had exploded. Social media was ablaze with hashtags, Justice for Amara, Caldwell controversy. Protesters gathered outside his building, their signs demanding accountability. Marcus watched from his window, their chants echoing up through the glass. He saw Amara's face in his mind, her words replaying, "I need you to see." He was starting to, but seeing wasn't enough. He had to act, and whatever he did next would define not just his legacy, but who he was. The next morning, Marcus woke to a city on fire with outrage. His phone was a battlefield of notifications, texts from his board, emails from his PR team, and a flood of social media mentions. The video had surfaced, grainy but unmistakable, captured by a security camera in the penthouse. It showed Victoria's hand meeting Amara's cheek, the sound sharp and jarring, followed by Amara's unflinching stare. The clip ended with Marcus stepping forward, his face a mask of shock. The internet had latched onto it, dissecting every frame, every expression. Commentators called it a microcosm of America's racial divide, and Marcus's silence was being read as complicity. He found Amara in the kitchen, preparing breakfast as if nothing had changed. The normalcy of her routine felt surreal against the chaos outside. "Amara," he said, his voice hoarse from a sleepless night, "have you seen what's happening?" She set a plate of toast down, her eyes meeting his. "I've seen it my whole life, Mr. Caldwell," she said. "This is just the first time it's on your TV screen." Her words were a gut punch, exposing the gap between her reality and his sheltered existence. Marcus sat at the counter, the weight of her words settling over him. "I want to fix this," he said. "Not just for you, but for everything." Amara raised an eyebrow, skeptical but curious. "Everything?" she asked. That's a big word for a man who didn't see this coming in his own home. Her bluntness was a mirror, forcing him to confront his ignorance. He nodded, accepting the rebuke. "Tell me what to do," he said. "I'm listening." Amara hesitated, then sat across from him, a rare moment of equality in a space defined by hierarchy. "You want to fix this," she said. "Start by understanding it's not just about me. It's about my kids, who get followed in stores because of their skin. It's about my brother, who's been stopped by cops for no reason. It's about every person who's told they don't belong. Every day." Her voice was steady, but her eyes glistened with unshed tears. Marcus felt a lump in his throat, His privilege laid bare in her words. He spent the day meeting with his team, not to craft a polished PR response, but to plan something real. He called community leaders, activists, and scholars, people he'd never thought to engage before. They were wary, some outright hostile, but he listened, taking notes, absorbing their anger and insight. By evening, he'd drafted a plan, not just a statement, but a commitment. He would fund a foundation to address systemic racism, starting with education and job programs in underserved communities. He wanted Amara's input, her voice, in shaping it. When he shared the idea with her, she was quiet for a long time. "It's a start," she said finally. "But don't think money fixes everything. You've got to change how you see the world, Mr. Caldwell. And that's harder than writing a check." Her words were a challenge, one he was determined to meet. He posted his statement online, not as a defense, but as an admission of his failures and a promise to do better. The response was mixed praise from some, skepticism from others, and outright anger from those who saw it as too little, too late. The next day, Victoria called, her voice dripping with indignation. "You've ruined me, Marcus," she said. "You let this blow up instead of protecting me." Marcus felt a surge of anger. "You did this to yourself," he said. "And you hurt someone who didn't deserve it." He hung up, his hands shaking. The call was a reminder of the world he'd inhabited, one where people like Victoria wielded power without consequence. He was done with that world. Outside, the protests grew louder, their chants now demanding justice not just for Amara, but for every person silenced by prejudice. Marcus watched from his window, feeling the weight of their voices. He knew his foundation was just a first step, a small piece in a much larger fight. But for the first time, he felt part of that fight, not just a bystander. Amara's words echoed in his mind. "You've got to change how you see the world." He was trying, and he wouldn't stop. The city pulsed with tension, and Marcus's penthouse felt like a pressure cooker. The protests outside had swelled, their signs now bearing Amara's name alongside demands for systemic change. News vans lined the street, their cameras trained on his building, waiting for his next move. Inside, Marcus was grappling with a decision that could redefine his legacy. His board was furious, warning that his public statement and proposed foundation were alienating investors. "You're turning a personal scandal into a corporate liability," his CFO snapped during a heated call. Marcus didn't care. For the first time, he saw his wealth not as a shield, but as a tool. He met Amara in the living room, where she was polishing the glass coffee table, the one that still held the tray with the bold yellow words, "Hate divides us all." "Amara," he said, sitting across from her, "I want you to help lead this foundation. Not just advise, lead." She froze, her cloth hovering over the glass. "Me?" she asked, her voice a mix of surprise and suspicion. "Why me?" "Because I'm the one who got slapped." Her bluntness cut through his idealism, forcing him to confront the optics of his offer. "No," he said, meeting her gaze. "Because you've lived this. You know what people need, what they're fighting for. I don't." Amara set the cloth down, her expression unreadable. "You're asking me to fix your mess," she said. "That's a lot to put on someone who's just trying to pay her bills." Marcus nodded, accepting the truth in her words. "I'm not asking you to fix me," he said. "I'm asking you to help me fix something bigger. And I'll do the work, too." Amara didn't answer right away. She stood, walked to the window, and looked out at the protesters below. "They're not just here for me," she said. "They're here because this happens every day, in places no one sees." Marcus joined her, the city sprawling beneath them, a mosaic of hope and pain. Then let's make sure they're seen, he said. Amara glanced at him, her eyes searching for sincerity. All right, she said finally. But this isn't your redemption story, Mr. Caldwell. It's mine. Over the next week, Marcus and Amara worked together, meeting with activists and community leaders to shape the Foundation's mission. It wasn't easy. There were arguments, misunderstandings, moments when Marcus's privilege blinded him to realities Amara had to spell out. But he listened, learning to check his assumptions, to question the systems he'd profited from. The Foundation took shape: scholarships for Black students, job training programs, and a public campaign to amplify voices like Amara's. It wasn't a cure, but it was a start. The backlash was immediate. Conservative pundits called Marcus a traitor to his class, while some activists dismissed his efforts as performative. Victoria, meanwhile, had gone public, painting herself as the victim of a misunderstanding and accusing Marcus of betraying her. Her interviews fueled the fire, with some outlets spinning the narrative to paint Amara as the aggressor. Marcus watched one of these segments, his jaw tight, as a commentator questioned Amara's character. He wanted to fight back, to sue for defamation, but Amara stopped him. Let them talk, she said. The truth doesn't need their permission. Her strength humbled him. He saw now how she'd carried this weight her whole life, navigating a world that judged her at every turn. He thought of his own life, how he'd coasted through, insulated by wealth and status. The realization was painful, but it fueled his resolve. He doubled down, using his platform to share Amara's story, to highlight the stories of others who'd faced similar injustices. His social media accounts, once filled with tech updates and motivational quotes, now carried messages of accountability and change. By the end of the week, the Foundation had a name: Unity Rising. Amara suggested it, a nod to the hope that could emerge from pain. Marcus felt a spark of optimism, but it was tempered by the reality outside. The protests hadn't stopped, and the city was a powder keg. He knew his actions were a drop in the bucket, but they were his drop, and he was committed to seeing it ripple. The launch of Unity Rising was set for a public event in Harlem, a deliberate choice to ground the Foundation in a community that had long been overlooked. Marcus stood backstage, his palms sweaty, as Amara prepared to speak. She'd insisted on addressing the crowd herself, not as a victim, but as a leader. Marcus had offered to hire a speechwriter, but she'd waved him off. "I've got my own voice," she said, and he believed her. The auditorium was packed: activists, reporters, locals, all buzzing with anticipation. Outside, protesters held signs, some supportive, others skeptical, their chants a reminder of the stakes. Amara took the stage, her presence commanding despite her simple black dress. "I'm not here because I was slapped," she began, her voice steady, resonating through the room. "I'm here because I've been standing my whole life, and I'm tired of being invisible." The crowd erupted, some cheering, others nodding in quiet recognition. She spoke of her children, her struggles, the countless others who faced the same daily indignities. Marcus watched from the wings, his heart pounding with a mix of pride and shame. She was turning her pain into power, and he was just a witness to her strength. But the event wasn't without tension. Halfway through, a group of hecklers interrupted, accusing Marcus of using Amara as a prop to save his image. "Where were you before this went viral?" one shouted. Marcus felt the sting, but Amara didn't flinch. She raised a hand, silencing the room. "He's here now," she said. "And so am I. The question is, what are we all going to do next?" Her words shifted the energy, refocusing the crowd on action, not blame. Marcus marveled at her ability to navigate the chaos, to turn anger into purpose. After the event, the media frenzy intensified. Some praised Unity Rising as a bold step. Others called it a publicity stunt. Marcus's board was livid, threatening to oust him if he didn't pull back. "You're risking everything we've built," his COO warned. Marcus didn't argue. He knew the risks his stock was dipping. Investors were pulling out, but he also knew what was at stake. He'd seen Amara's face, heard her voice, felt the weight of her truth. He couldn't go back to the man he'd been. That night, he and Amara sat in a small diner, away from the cameras and chaos. She sipped coffee, her eyes tired but bright. "You didn't have to do this," she said. "You could have stayed quiet, kept your life." Marcus shook his head. "That life wasn't real," he said. "It was comfortable, but it wasn't true." Amara smiled faintly, the first real smile he'd seen from her since the incident. "Truth's a hard thing to live with," she said, "but it's worth it." The next day, Marcus faced his board. They demanded he step back from Unity Rising, focus on damage control. He refused. "This isn't about saving face," he said. "It's about doing what's right." The room fell silent, the air heavy with their disapproval. He knew he was risking his position, his fortune, but he also knew he'd already gained something more valuable: perspective. Outside, the city was changing. Unity Rising's programs were gaining traction, with local leaders stepping up to guide its work. Amara was at the forefront, her voice growing stronger, her vision clearer. Marcus supported her, but he was learning to step back, to amplify rather than lead. The slap that had started it all was fading into the background, replaced by a movement that was bigger than any one moment. But the fight was far from over, and Marcus knew he was just beginning to understand his role in it. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind. Unity Rising gained momentum, its programs drawing attention from community organizers and national leaders alike. Amara became its face, her speeches raw and powerful, cutting through the noise of pundits and skeptics. Marcus, meanwhile, faced mounting pressure from his board. They'd called an emergency meeting to vote on his removal as CEO, citing his reckless focus on social issues over profit. He sat in his office, staring at the city skyline, wondering if he'd pushed too far, too fast. But every time doubt crept in, he thought of Amara's words: "You've got to change how you see the world." The meeting was brutal. His CFO presented a grim financial outlook. Stock prices were down, investors were spooked, and competitors were circling. "You've turned Caldwell Tech into a soapbox," the CFO said, his voice cold. Marcus didn't flinch. "I've turned it into something that matters," he countered. The vote was close, but he retained his position by a single vote, a Pyrrhic victory that left him drained but resolute. He knew the fight wasn't over, and neither was his transformation. Amara, meanwhile, was navigating her own challenges. The media had latched onto her, some portraying her as a hero, others as an opportunist. She received hate mail, threats, even calls to her home. Marcus offered to hire security, but she refused. "I've been dealing with this my whole life," she said. "I'm not hiding now." Her resilience was a lesson in courage, one Marcus was still learning. He began attending community meetings with her, listening to stories of struggle and hope, each one chipping away at the walls of his privilege. One evening, at a youth center funded by Unity Rising, Marcus met Amara's teenage son, Jamal. The boy was quiet, his eyes guarded, but he spoke with a clarity that stunned Marcus. "My mom's always been strong," Jamal said. "But what you're doing gets making people listen." Marcus felt a lump in his throat. He'd spent years building tech that connected people. But this was the first time he felt truly connected to another person's reality. The backlash continued to grow. Victoria resurfaced, filing a lawsuit against Marcus for defamation, claiming his public statements had ruined her reputation. The case was flimsy, but it kept the story in the headlines, fueling division. Some saw Marcus as a traitor to his class, others as a savior trying to buy redemption. He ignored the noise, focusing on the work. Unity Rising's first scholarship recipients were announced. Young Black students who'd never dreamed of college now given a chance. At the ceremony, Amara spoke, her voice carrying a quiet power. This isn't about charity. It's about justice. Marcus watched from the audience, his heart swelling with a mix of pride and humility. He was learning to step back, to let Amara and others lead. But the weight of his past inaction lingered. He thought of the years he'd spent blind to the struggles around him, profiting from a system that favored him. The guilt was heavy, but it drove him to keep going, to keep listening, to keep changing. By month's end, Unity Rising had secured partnerships with major organizations, its reach expanding beyond New York. Amara was invited to speak at a national conference on racial justice, her voice now a beacon for change. Marcus attended, sitting in the back, unnoticed but present. He saw the crowd hang on her every word, saw the hope she inspired. For the first time, he felt like he was part of something bigger than himself, something that might outlast his wealth, his name, his mistakes. But the road ahead was uncertain. The lawsuit, the board, the protests, they were all reminders that change came at a cost. Marcus was ready to pay it, but he knew the real work was just beginning. Amara's words echoed in his mind. Truth's a hard thing to live with, but it's worth it. He was starting to understand what that meant, and he wasn't turning back. The lawsuit became a circus, with Victoria's legal team painting her as a misunderstood philanthropist caught in a moment of passion. Marcus sat in the courtroom, his jaw tight, as her lawyer twisted the narrative, claiming Amara had provoked the incident. The grainy security footage was played on loop, each frame dissected to fit their story. Marcus's lawyers urged him to settle, to avoid further damage to his reputation. But he refused. This isn't about me, he told them. It's about Amara. It's about the truth. Amara sat beside him, her posture rigid, her eyes fixed on the judge. She'd insisted on testifying, despite the risks. When she took the stand, the room fell silent. She spoke of the slap, yes, but also of the years of quiet indignities being ignored, undervalued, judged. I didn't ask for this, she said, her voice steady but raw. But I'm here because silence doesn't change anything. The jury listened, some nodding, others stone-faced. Marcus watched, his heart pounding, knowing her words were reaching beyond the courtroom. The trial was a lightning rod, drawing attention to Unity Rising and its mission. Donations poured in, but so did threats. Amara's home was vandalized, her car spray-painted with slurs. Marcus offered to relocate her family, but she stood firm. This is my home, she said. I'm not running. Her courage was afire, and Marcus felt it igniting something in him. He began speaking out more, not just about the incident, but about the systems that allowed it to happen. His interviews were raw, unpolished, a far cry from the polished CEO he'd once been. The board's patience was wearing thin. They issued an ultimatum: step back from Unity Rising or lose control of Caldwell Tech. Marcus spent sleepless nights weighing his options. He'd built the company from nothing, poured his life into it, but now it felt like a relic of a man he no longer recognized. He met with Amara, seeking her perspective. You don't have to lose everything to do what's right, she said. But you do have to choose what matters. Her words clarified his path. He chose the fight. At a press conference, Marcus announced he was stepping down as CEO to focus on Unity rising full-time. The room erupted, cameras flashing, reporters shouting questions. He didn't flinch. "I've spent years building wealth," he said. "Now I'm building something that lasts." The decision sent shockwaves through the tech world, his stock plummeting, his legacy in question. But for the first time, Marcus felt free. He was no longer tethered to a system that demanded his silence. Amara, meanwhile, was becoming a force. Her speeches drew crowds, her story inspiring a movement. She wasn't just Marcus's maid anymore, she was a leader, a voice for those who'd been silenced. Unity Rising expanded, opening community centers, funding legal aid for discrimination cases, amplifying stories like hers. Marcus worked alongside her, learning to listen, to follow, to amplify rather than lead. It wasn't easy as ego. His privilege still tripped him up, but he was committed to the work. The trial ended with a hung jury, a bittersweet outcome. Victoria walked free, but the public had seen the truth. Her reputation was in tatters, her socialite status a memory. Marcus didn't care about her fatigue, cared about Amara's, about the people Unity Rising was reaching. The vandalism, the threats, they didn't stop, but neither did Amara. She was a reminder that change wasn't a moment, but a marathon, and Marcus was learning to run it with her. A year later, the Manhattan skyline looked different to Marcus. The city was still a beast of ambition and chaos, but he saw it now through a lens of purpose. Unity Rising had grown beyond his expectations, with programs in 10 cities, led by people like Amara who'd lived the struggle. Marcus was no longer a billionaire in the traditional sense. Stepping down from Caldwell Tech had cost him much of his fortune, but he was richer in ways he couldn't have imagined. He'd traded boardrooms for community centers, stock options for stories of hope. Amara stood at the forefront, her voice a beacon. She'd written a book, not about the slap, but about the resilience of those who faced prejudice every day. It was a bestseller, her words reaching millions. At a signing event, Marcus watched her interact with readers, her smile genuine, her strength unshakable. She'd invited him to speak, not as a savior, but as a partner. "You've changed," she told him later, over coffee in that same Harlem diner. "But don't stop. None of us can." Marcus nodded, thinking of the journey they'd shared. The slap had been a spark, igniting a fire that exposed the fault lines in his world. He'd lost friends, wealth, status, but he'd gained something far greater, a purpose. Unity Rising wasn't perfect. There were missteps, criticisms, moments of doubt, but it was real. It was changing lives, one scholarship, one job, one story at a time. The protests had quieted, but the movement hadn't. Across the country, people were speaking out, demanding justice, building on the momentum Amara had started. Marcus saw her face on billboards, her words quoted in speeches, her story a catalyst for change. He was proud, not of himself, but of her, of the people she'd inspired. He'd learned to step back, to listen, to amplify voices that had been silenced for too long. One evening, Marcus visited the youth center where Jamal now volunteered, mentoring kids who reminded him of himself. The walls were covered in art, messages of hope and resistance. One painting stood out, a vibrant mural of a woman with Amara's eyes, standing tall against a stormy sky. Below it, in bold yellow letters edged in black, were the words, "Hate divides, love unites." Marcus smiled, remembering the cloth on his coffee table, the spark that had started it all. He thought of his old life, the penthouse, the power, the privilege. It felt like a distant memory, a chapter closed. He was still learning, still stumbling, but he was moving forward. Amara's words echoed in his mind. Truth's a hard thing to live with, but it's worth it. He'd faced the truth, and it had changed him. It had changed everything. As he left the center, the city lights twinkling around him, Marcus felt a quiet peace. The fight wasn't over, but he was in it, not as a savior, but as a student, a partner, a human. Amara's story, their story, was a reminder that change began with really seeing the world as it was, and daring to make it better. And for the first time, Marcus knew he was exactly where he was meant to be.